The day my marriage ended, I was standing in the parking lot of a Kroger in Asheville, North Carolina, holding a rotisserie chicken and a bag of russet potatoes, and I couldn't remember which car was mine. Not because I'd forgotten. I just couldn't make myself move toward it. My husband had called 40 minutes earlier. He said the words carefully, like he'd been practicing. He said he'd been thinking. He said he'd done a lot of thinking, actually, over the past several months, and he'd come to realize that our life together wasn't giving him what he needed. He said he needed someone who could give him a family. I said, "We've been trying for 2 years." He said, "I know." I said, "I've been to 11 appointments this year alone." He said, "I know, and I'm sorry, but I need to be honest with you." Honest, like honesty, was the gift he was giving me, wrapped up in the parking lot of a Kroger on a Tuesday afternoon. His name was Daniel. We'd been married 4 years. We'd been together for 6. I drove home, put the chicken in the refrigerator, and sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet until the light through the window changed from gold to grey. The house was his. That was the first thing his mother reminded me of when I called to tell her what happened. Not because I expected sympathy, but because I didn't know who else to call. My own mother had passed 3 years before. My younger sister lived in Portland and had 2 kids under 4 in her own life. My best friend from college, the one who'd been my maid of honor, had moved to London 2 years earlier, so I called Daniel's mother. She picked up on the second ring. I figured he'd finally done it, she said. And then she caught herself and added, "I'm sorry, sweetheart, I really am. But the house is in his name. You should know that." I did know that. I'd known it for 4 years and told myself it didn't matter because we were married and married people share things, and that's what love is. I had 30 days to find somewhere else to go. Daniel, to his credit, or maybe out of guilt, or maybe because his lawyer told him to, gave me $6,000 and said it was to help me get started. $6,000 after 6 years. It wasn't nothing. It also wasn't anything close to what those 6 years had cost me. I took it. I didn't have the energy to fight him. My body was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I found the rental listing on a Wednesday night, sitting cross-legged on the bedroom floor surrounded by boxes I didn't know how to fill. A 1-bedroom cottage on the edge of a small town called Calder, about 40 minutes outside Asheville. The landlord was an older woman named Mrs. Hensley, who responded to my inquiry at 10:30 at night and said she'd been meaning to rent it for 2 seasons, but hadn't gotten around to it. The rent was $900 a month. She didn't require a credit check. She said she could tell over email when someone needed a quiet place. I moved in on a Saturday in March. My sister drove up from her layover in Charlotte to help me unload the truck. She didn't say much. She just carried boxes and made sure I ate a sandwich and hugged me in the driveway for a long time before she left. The cottage sat at the end of a gravel road with 2 other houses, a pale yellow one that belonged to an older couple who kept a vegetable garden, and a darker one at the far end with a green truck parked outside, and a large dog who barked once when I arrived, and then went quiet. I didn't meet my neighbor for 3 weeks. It happened because of the window. The bathroom window had a broken latch that let cold air in at night, and I'd stuffed a dish towel in the frame for the first 3 weeks, which solved nothing and made me feel helpless every time I looked at it. I'd left a message from Mrs. Hensley. She hadn't gotten back to me. I was standing on the porch that morning drinking coffee, not really looking at anything, when the man from the dark house at the end of the road walked by with his dog. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, lean and focused, the kind of dog that looks like it has a job. The man was tall, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a quiet way of moving that made him easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. He slowed when he saw me. "Morning," he said. "Morning," he said. He almost kept walking. Then he stopped. "You're the one who moved into the Hensley place." "That's me." He nodded like this confirmed something. Then, "Everything working okay in there?" I don't know why I told him about the window. I wasn't looking for help. I think I was just tired of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. "There's a bathroom window with a broken latch," I said. "I've had a dish towel in it for 3 weeks. He looked at the house for a moment. "I've got a toolkit. I can fix that in 10 minutes if you want." His name was Garrett. He fixed the window in 8 minutes, told me Mrs. Hensley's voicemail had been broken since November, and left without asking for anything. I stood in the bathroom after he left and looked at the window, latched properly for the first time, and cried for reasons I couldn't fully explain. The following weeks were the quietest of my life, which sounds like it should be peaceful, but mostly felt like pressure. I was working remotely as a medical billing specialist. I'd kept the job through the divorce, one of the only things that was entirely mine, and I filled my days with spreadsheets and claim codes and the particular numbness of work that requires precision, but not imagination. In the evenings I walked. Calder is the kind of town that's easy to walk. 2 main streets, a diner, a hardware store, a library that closed at 5, a river trail that went for about 2 miles before turning into underbrush. I walked the river trail every evening and tried not to think. I saw Garrett occasionally. He was polite, and not much more than that. He waved from his truck. Once, when I came home to find a branch had fallen across the cottage driveway during a storm, it was already cleared by the time I got back from the grocery store. I asked Mrs. Hensley about it. She said she hadn't sent anyone. I figured it was Garrett. I knocked on his door to say thank you. He opened it, looked slightly uncomfortable being thanked, and said it was nothing. It was on the way to the road anyway. Do you want to come in for coffee? I asked, because I didn't know what else to say. He paused like he was calculating something. Then he said, sure. He stayed for 40 minutes. We talked about the town. He'd grown up 2 counties over, moved to Calder 4 years ago. He didn't say much about what he did for work, and I didn't press, because I also hadn't been volunteering much about my own life. Before he left, he said, the diner on Marsh Street does a good Wednesday special, brisket, in case you haven't tried it yet. I tried it the following Wednesday. He was there, sitting at the counter. He moved over 1 stool, and we ate brisket and talked for an hour and a half. That was how it started. Slowly, like something that didn't know it was starting. Daniel called in April. I'd half expected this. He'd gotten engaged. He didn't say that directly. He said he'd met someone and things were moving quickly and he thought I should hear it from him. I asked how long they'd been together. He said since December. December. We hadn't finished the divorce paperwork until February. I said, I hope you're happy. And I meant it in the flattest possible way, and he probably knew that, and I hung up and sat on the porch steps until my hands stopped shaking. Garrett found me there an hour later when he was coming back from a run with his dog. He stopped at the edge of the driveway. He didn't ask what was wrong, he just said, you want company, or you want quiet. I said, company, I think. He sat on the bottom step. His dog lay down in the grass nearby. We didn't talk for a while. Then I said, my ex-husband just told me he's basically engaged to someone else. They got together in December. We signed divorce papers in February. Garrett didn't say anything for a moment. Then, that's a hard thing to hear. The worst part, I said, is that I'm not even surprised, and I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Probably both, he said. We sat there until the light went. He didn't offer solutions or silver linings or advice about what I should have done differently. He just stayed. It was the most useful thing anyone had done for me in months. May came and brought something I hadn't planned for. I'd been tired in a specific way for about 2 weeks. Bone tired, the kind that coffee didn't touch. I'd been nauseated in the mornings. Briefly, in a way I wrote off as stress. I'd missed a cycle, and told myself it was because my body was still recovering from everything, from the medications I'd taken during our infertility treatments, from the move, from the ongoing low-grade grief that had been my baseline since March. I took a test on a Tuesday morning because I finally ran out of reasons not to. I sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after. The timing was, it wasn't impossible. Garrett and I had been spending more and more evenings together, and 2 weeks earlier, something had shifted between us in the way that things do when 2 people have been carefully not shifting for long enough. Neither of us had intended it to be anything, and then it was something, and neither of us had talked about it since, in the way that people do when they're both scared of what talking about it might cost them. I went outside and sat on the porch and watched the green truck in his driveway. I thought about every version of this conversation I didn't want to have. Then I walked to the end of the road and knocked on his door. He opened it. He looked at my face. He said, "Come in," I told him. I didn't make it a speech. I just said the words plainly, and then waited. He stood in his kitchen for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." He said, "Are you okay?" That was the first question he asked. Not, "Are you sure?" And not, "What are you going to do?" And not any of the things I'd braced myself for. Just whether I was okay. I started crying in a way I hadn't since the kitchen floor in March. Daniel found out in June. I don't know how, probably through mutual friends, or someone from Asheville who'd seen me in Calder and put things together. He showed up at the cottage unannounced on a Saturday morning when Garrett was there having coffee. He stood in my doorway and looked at Garrett and then looked at me and said, "So this is what you've been doing." I said, "You ended our marriage, Daniel." He said he needed to talk to me privately. Garrett stood up. I told him he didn't have to leave. He said it was fine and took his coffee outside, but I noticed he didn't go far. Daniel said things I won't repeat in full. He implied that my pregnancy was somehow a betrayal. He questioned whether I'd actually been trying during our marriage, whether something had been off with me all along, whether I'd been sabotaging us in some way he'd never understood. He said it in the voice men use when they want to sound measured and calm while saying something cruel. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "You left me with $6,000, 30 days to leave a house we'd shared for 4 years, and a voicemail from your mother telling me the house was in your name. You were engaged before we were divorced. I don't owe you this conversation." He left. Garrett came back inside. He refilled his coffee. He sat back down at the table. He said, "You did good." I said, "I have about 40 things I wish I'd also said." He said, "You can tell me, and we'll count it." I laughed for the first time in what felt like weeks. The pregnancy was not straightforward. My blood pressure climbed in the 3rd trimester in a way that worried my OB, Dr. Fanning, who had been calm and precise through every appointment and now wore an expression I'd learned to read as controlled concern. She used the word preeclampsia. She explained what it meant. She said we'd monitor it closely, but I should be prepared for the possibility of early delivery. I was also, as of the 20-week scan, expecting 2. I had not known this. There was no history of twins in my family. Garrett's mother, when he called her that evening, laughed and said there were twins on his father's side, and she'd meant to mention that at some point. He held the phone away from his face and looked at me. I said, "It's fine, it's fine, it's fine. How many?" "His grandmother was one of a set," he said. "That's 1 generation back," I said. "That's directly relevant information, Garrett." "I'm telling you now," he said. He was smiling. I was smiling. I didn't know when exactly we'd gone from neighbours to this, but we had. My sister drove down from Portland when I was 34 weeks. She stayed in the cottage with me because Garrett and I had talked about the future seriously by then, but hadn't made any formal decisions, and I wanted my sister there. Wanted the particular comfort of someone who had known me my whole life, and loved me before any of this had happened. She met Garrett on the first evening. She shook his hand very firmly and looked at him for a long time in the assessing way she'd always done with everyone I'd ever brought into my life. Later, when he'd gone back to his house, she said, "He's different." I said, "Different how?" She said, "He looks at you like he's paying attention." Daniel had looked at me like he was waiting for something. I'd spent 6 years not quite knowing what. The girls were born in October, 7 weeks early, both of them small and loud in the NICU at Mission Hospital in Asheville, with the kind of determination that makes nurses laugh. The older by 4 minutes was 4 pounds 9 ounces. Her sister was 4 pounds 3. They were both fine. They were, the neonatologist told us, genuinely fine. Lungs clear, reflexes strong, already staging a competition for who could cry louder. Garrett was in the waiting room through the whole thing. When Dr. Tubler, Fanning, came out to tell him, he sat very still for a moment and then put his face in his hands and breathed. I saw it from the doorway. I hadn't known I was watching for it. Daniel came back one more time. This was January, 4 months after the girls were born, when I was running on broken sleep and dry shampoo and a deep animal love I hadn't known I was capable of. He came to the cottage, again unannounced, which I'd come to understand was his way of trying to catch me off balance. And he stood in the living room looking at the portable cribs and the burp cloths draped over every surface, and said he'd heard I was still in Calder, and he wanted to know what my plans were. I said, "My plans?" He said he wanted to make sure I was being realistic. He said Calder wasn't a place with a lot of opportunity. He said he was genuinely asking because he still cared, in his way. Garrett came in from the kitchen. He'd been there the whole time. He set a glass of water on the coffee table with the particular unhurriedness of someone who has no need to perform. He said, "I think you should probably go, Daniel." Daniel looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recalibration. He said, "And you are?" Garrett said his name. He said it the way people say their name when the name itself is not the point. Daniel looked at me. He said, "Is this guy going to speak for you now?" I said, "No. He's just pointing out what I was about to say." Garrett sat down in the armchair. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. There was something in his stillness. The same stillness I'd noticed on the porch steps in April. The stillness of someone who has been in difficult situations and learned that noise rarely improves them. That made the room feel very small around Daniel. Daniel left. I went to the kitchen and Garrett was already making tea. He said, "You doing okay?" I said, "Getting there." What I didn't know in January, what I found out in March from Mrs. Hensley of all people during a phone call about a broken gutter, was that Garrett had bought the house at the end of the road from its previous owner 18 months before I moved in. And what I found out later from Garrett himself when I asked him directly was that the previous owner had needed to sell quickly, and Garrett had made it happen quickly, the way you can when capital is not your obstacle. Garrett was not broke. Garrett was not struggling. Garrett was, I had to sit with this information for a few days, someone who had spent the better part of a decade building something quietly, in the background, in the way that people do when they're not interested in being seen for their resources and are only interested in being seen for everything else. He'd left a career in federal contract work 4 years earlier, when it had stopped meaning anything to him. He'd come to Calder because it was small and unhurried, and he'd wanted to find out who he was, without the scaffolding of a high-clearance salary and the title that impressed people at dinner parties. I told him I felt strange, not having known. He said, "Would it have changed anything? For you?" I thought about the porch steps in April. The cleared driveway, the window, the brisket, the way he'd asked if I was okay before anything else. I said, "No." He said, "Then it was the right amount to know." I think about what I lost in the years I spent trying to become someone Daniel's idea of a good life had room for. I think about the fertility appointments, the way I'd apologized for my body's reluctance, the way I'd learned to make myself smaller around his certainty. I think about $6,000 in 30 days and a kitchen floor in March. And then I think about 2 small girls who sleep in the next room, who are currently, I can hear it through the monitor, engaged in what sounds like an extremely serious conversation with each other, in a language only they understand. I think about a house at the end of a gravel road, which is mine now too, because Garrett asked me in December, and I said yes. And not because of the house, but because of every moment that had added up to the question. My sister called last week. She said, "Are you happy?" I had to think about it. Not because I wasn't, but because happy felt like too small a word for what I actually meant. I said, "I'm not afraid anymore." She was quiet for a second. She said, "Yeah, that's better." It is. It really is. The monitor just went quiet. One of them is asleep. The other one is still talking, to herself, to her sister, to whoever she imagines is listening. She has a lot to say and no interest in being interrupted. I don't know where she gets it. I sit with my tea and I listen, and the night outside the window is cold and clear and entirely mine. I used to think that the hardest part of losing everything was the losing itself. The call in the parking lot, the 30 days, the $6,000 that was supposed to stand in for 6 years. I thought the pain was the event, the moment Daniel said the words and the world rearranged itself around them. But looking back now, I think the hardest part was quieter than that. It was the months I spent believing that what happened to me was somehow a reflection of what I was worth, that if I'd been different, more patient, more resilient, more capable of giving him the one thing he said he needed, none of it would have happened. I carried that weight into every room I entered, into the cottage on the gravel road, into every morning I woke up alone with my spreadsheets and my river walks and my careful, practiced numbness. What I have come to understand, not from a book, not from a therapist, though I've had both, is that the story we tell ourselves about why things went wrong determines everything about what we build next. Daniel told me a story in which I was the variable that didn't fit the equation. I almost believed it. I believed it long enough to accept $6,000 without fighting, long enough to leave a house that 4 years of my life had made a home, long enough to mistake his certainty for truth. Garrett never told me a story about myself. He just showed up. He fixed the window. He moved over one stool at the diner counter. He asked if I was okay before he asked anything else. And in doing that, consistently, without fanfare, over months of ordinary Tuesday mornings and river trail evenings, he gave me something no one had in a long time. He gave me the experience of being seen without being evaluated. That's not luck. That's not fate dropping a good man at the end of a gravel road. That's what happens when you stop performing and start being honest about what you actually need. I moved to Calder because I needed quiet. I knocked on Garrett's door because the window was broken and I was tired of pretending it wasn't. Every small, honest act of not pretending led to the next one. That's the whole story, really. That's the mechanics of it. The girls are asleep right now, both of them, finally, at the same time, which feels like a minor miracle and which I am choosing not to examine too closely in case acknowledging it breaks the spell. The house is quiet in the way that houses with small children are quiet, provisional, fragile, precious. I think about the woman who sat on the kitchen floor in Asheville, and I feel something for her that isn't quite pity and isn't quite pride. It's something closer to recognition. She was doing the best she could with what she'd been told she was. The problem was never her. The problem was that she'd been in the wrong container for so long she'd forgotten she could grow. That's the only thing I want anyone to take from this. Not that good things come to those who wait. That's too passive, too easy. But that honest, living compounds. Every time you refuse to make yourself smaller than you are, every time you say the true thing instead of the comfortable thing, every time you knock on the door, even though you're scared of what asking for help might cost you, those acts add up. They add up into a life that actually fits. Mine fits now. For the first time in a long time, it really does.